In the world of modern Rolex, there are subs and then there are subs. Any of us would be happy with a Submariner, whether it be a two-liner from the early 1990s or the 2000s, my personal favorite series, or the more recent super cases with date complications or no dates, green ceramic bezels, blue dials, precious metals, you name it, you can get it. But then you get your specialty pieces, the ones that look like your typical everyday Submariner, but on closer inspection, well, we know they are something different. It continually fascinates me today that we are so inundated with this design. As someone who has spent years in this hobby at this point, and like some of you, probably taken the study and research of these pieces way too far. If you are not an enthusiast who has studied the references, the histories, the significance of the individual pieces, well, you would say that these watches all look the same, and I can't blame you. Who besides us, in this incredibly small niche, cares about the differences between a Submariner and a Sea Dweller? And I think the reality is that Rolex themselves have sort of blurred the line between the two collections by now. And this is the thing, for the longest time we've talked about how Rolex doesn't really care about looking back into their histories and defining their watches by where they originated and where they are now. They like to push the envelope and develop the watches next to the technology that they have available to them. This is the argument that we had maybe 5 years ago, but recent developments have shown us that the brand does care. How the recent anniversary edition Le Monde Daytona exhibits so many elements that belong to the 6263 and earlier references of that collection. Now, I would like to believe that the Sea Dweller is a watch that deserves a lot more attention, because when we think Rolex dive watch, we immediately think Submariner. Just take a look at the earliest reference, 1655. Most of us would assume it's a Submariner. But those of us here who know a little bit about vintage watches would know that the two lines of text means something different. The introduction of the helium escape valve around 1967 and proving that this watch could travel down 3 times further than the Submariner could at the time. How about the 16660? First time we saw this watch with a sapphire crystal, again, it looks like a Submariner. The only thing that separates the two is the fact that the Submariner has a Cyclops, this watch doesn't. You see, once upon a time, the Submariner and the Sea Dweller, these two watches were very hard to distinguish. At a quick glance, even as far back as the early 2000s, you would have to really know your watches to be able to tell the difference. We look to the last aluminium bezel Sea Dweller, the 16600, and again, you would swear it's a 16610 without a Cyclops. Now today there is a big divide between the Submariner, the Sea Dweller, and the Deep Sea, as we know. The dimensions of these watches, it means everything. The Sea Dweller, with its single red line of text, 43mm, and the Deep Sea, like the James Cameron, boasts 44mm all the way to 50, when we look to the full titanium Deep Sea challenge. But winding the clocks back to 2014, where these professional watches were phasing out the aluminium bezels in favor of ceramic, transitioning from your standard lug cases to super cases. Before the Sea Dweller was up to 43mm in diameter and beyond, we had the 116600, the SD4K. The Goldilocks Sea Dweller, we could say, arguably still to this day, over a decade later, the most unfairly great dive watch that the brand has ever produced. Now we have to ask ourselves what is so special about this watch, and context is key. The context of the early 2010s and how so much was changing in the landscape of what Rolex as a brand was doing. From hollow links to solid links, from stamped clasps to milled clasps, 316L to 904L, and the evolution of the Submariner from a fairly slim, tapered case to a super case. This was a big deal. This was Rolex putting their foot down and saying that this is our new modern collection. To this day, it's debated whether or not the range was well received. We all remember these arguments, the watches keeping their 40mm diameter but wearing bigger just because there is more steel on the wrist. But the issue is, even into the 2000s, the Sea Dweller was a watch that couldn't really separate itself from the Submariner line. Visually, these watches looked identical, but the Submariner had a better cachet. Its name was more recognizable. So in 2014, the SD4K, it arrives at Basel World, and it did not receive massive applause. And in fact, even in hindsight, we look at this watch now, can understand why people were quite bored by the idea. Also considering that the price of the watch went up next to the Submariner, and only with a few minor adjustments that only the true enthusiast would notice or care about. This watch only survived for 3 years, between 2014 and 2017, and I believe it was phased out because, well, it just wasn't that popular. Right around this time we saw the Deep Sea take hold, a far greater watch, easier visual distinction between it and the Submariner. Of course, people gravitated to that. And if I remember right, a year later, the Sea Dweller 43 arrived, cementing the larger diameter of this collection, stirring up a lot of controversy with a Cyclops lens. and a faithful nod to its past with a red line of text on its dial. The 116600 was largely forgotten because it looked fairly generic. But years on, many of us wish we had seen the wood for the trees, because this piece was their magnum opus. It was the first of the ceramic bezel sea dwellers and the last of the 40mm sea dweller. And referring to the context at the time, why so many gravitated to this watch especially was the entirely bespoke tapered case that this watch was supplied with. Many who disliked the super case of the Submariner went after this one, and if you were one of those people, then you are incredibly lucky, and I hope the watch is still with you. Because that tapered case served a far greater purpose, a classic callback to those watches of the 90s and the 2000s. With it, we saw that the thickness of the crown guards were reduced in size, which meant that the crown access was far better. This watch had a matte black dial, which was something quite significant to the Sea Dweller line. Of course, one of the most iconic features and details that made this piece all the more appealing and alluring, especially in the modern era, the date window, it lacked a Cyclops lens. Yet another subtle nod that defined the Sea Dweller from the very beginning. But to make this watch all the more exponentially great was the fully graduated bezel insert. Something we had never seen on the Sea Dweller at the time. Years on, the SD43 is defined by this trait. And let's not forget the novelty factor in 2014 of the glide lock system. And of course the additional diver's extension, which I think Rolex has now phased out. You can't get those flip out extensions very easily. And what brings it all together was the helium escape valve on the side of the case. Stepping back, looking at this watch as a whole, this piece should not exist. We could say now that this watch was purely a testing platform, a prototype, a proof of concept for the later SD43. Many of the elements that have come to define this watch were extrapolated and put in the larger watch. And we ask ourselves, why was it discontinued after 3 years? I think it was seen as quite a generic model, unexciting, too similar to the Submariner. Rolex, with all of their visuals and marketing, obviously wanted to make the Sea Dweller much more of a statement piece. 5 years ago, we would have said that Rolex is a brand that doesn't really look back. They like to move forward with the technology of the time. But the irony is that this particular SD4K closed a very important chapter in the development of the Sea Dweller line. It's seen as the transitional reference between the old and the new. The last point I have left in this video, which is sort of rhetorical, it's open-ended, is why haven't we seen a great design like this again? Why is it that even 10 years on, we look across to the SD4K and say, yeah, this was a moment in time. We all wish we could own it and we appreciate it for its subtlety. Where is the Submariner and the Sea Dweller line today? All in favor of wrist presence. The Sea Dweller and the Deep Sea have gone from extreme to extreme. Most recently, the brand producing a solid gold version of their deepest dive watch. Time was that these professional dive watches were intended to be tools. And now, well, you get the picture. The SD4K will always be a legendary watch because it went against the grain of Rolex at the time, and even to this day, it still goes against a lot of what the brand practices. The beauty of great design is in its subtlety, and it doesn't necessarily ask for your attention. What ultimately ended the life of the Sea Dweller 4000 was the fact that it was too generic, that folks couldn't separate it easily enough from the Submariner. But to this day, it remains a watch that if it had to return in this format, we would welcome it with open arms. And that is essentially what makes a great watch like this timeless. I would like to hold on that belief that the Sea Dweller returns to this format one day. But that is the plight of the designer. You live in eternal optimism with a hope for something that's probably never going to happen. What is it about this ceramic reference, Sea Dweller 4000, that draws you in? Is it the legendary status? Is it the collectability? Or is it because it's a watch that fundamentally appreciates where it originated? And thank you for taking the time to watch this video. See you in the next one.